So we're now on Daf Mem Vavam Beis. And again, the Gemara is going to analyze the statement of Rav, that Rav says that Tnufa Makeves, without Tnufa, the Nazir is not permitted. He has not completed his Nazirus. And this is according to Rabbi Eliezer. The Gemara says, Umima Akfa, is it really true that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Tnufa is Makeves? And without it, the Nazir is not permitted to drink wine. Vasanya, we learned in a Brisa, and there's a pasuk in the parsha of Nazir that says, Zos Toras HaNazir. The word Torah implies that there's a Torah achas, that all Nazirim are shava. And that's the word Toras. Toras means Torah achas, l'chol Nazirim. And it's interesting that the Gemara Menachos on Daf Gimel Amid Beis derives from the pasuk in Vayikra Vav, V'zos Toras HaMincha, the same idea that all Menachos have the same din. And when it says V'nasan al Kapei Nazir, which is the pasuk for Tnufa, it's talking about a Nazir. And it would have been enough to say V'nasan al Kapei Nazir, or al Kapo, even without the word Nazir. And therefore, in the Tosefta, you have the extra word HaNazir to teach me that Nazir, in all cases, even if he doesn't have a palm, he doesn't have a kaf, we will do the Tnufa. But anyway, it says here in our Brisa that Bein sheyesh lo kapayim, bein shein lo kapayim, which means that Tnufa is not makeves, because the Torah is telling us that a Nazir, no matter which Nazir, even if he has no palms, he would still complete his Nazirus, like a Nazir who has kapayim, and they implemented the Tnufa with his kapayim. So we see clearly that Tnufa is not makeves, and it's against Rav. Now, the assumption is that this brisa should be reconciled even with Rabbi Eliezer, because we said that as far as the Rabban and the Chacham in the brisa are concerned, there was never a havamina that Tnufa would be makeves. And even if ein lo kapayim, he would be mater zisurin in the Nazirus without Tnufa. So this brisa apparently reflects the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. Now, we had Xer Shav according to Chachamim that Tiglachas is not Makeves, and from that we derived through a Kal V'chomer that Tnufa ain't Makeves. So I would not need this pasuk of Zos Toras HaNazir in the case of a Nazir Shein Lo Kapayim. This brisa, therefore, by process of elimination, would have to reflect the sheet of Rabbi Eliezer. And having said that, then we see that Tiglachas is Eina Makeves, even according to Rabbi Eliezer. And that takes us back to the principle that we had on Daf Mem Vavam and Aleph, namely that Tnufa is only Shiari Mitzvah. So the Gemara now is going to have to reinterpret this brisa in a way that it shouldn't contradict Rav. The Ella. So the Gemara says the following. Now, we're assuming that according to this brisa, if a Nazir has no kapayim, then from the pasuk Toras, we're going to derive the conclusion that Tnufa is not makeves, which is, by the way, a real problem from a Shas perspective, because in Shas, we always have a principle called Kol aroy lebila ein bila makeves bo, kol shein aroy lebila bila makeves bo. And here he's not even roy letnufa, and therefore tnufa should be makeves. But nevertheless, we have this pasuk Toras, which equates all Nazirim, and therefore tnufa is not makeves. So what are you going to do with another brisa? If the conclusion is that Tnufa Eida Makeves derived from the pasuk of Toras and Nazir, and therefore even Ein Lo Kapayim, he'll be Messiah as Nazirus without Tnufa. So Desanya, what do you do with the brisa that derives from the same pasuk, Zos Toras HaNazir, And now we're going to get into the question of a Nazir who's bald, and he doesn't have the possibility of tiglachas. And once again, the word Toras in this second brisa is going to be interpreted to teach me that we equate all Nazirim. And therefore, bein sheyesh lo seyor, bein she'ein lo seyor. And he doesn't have hair in his head. He can't possibly do tiglachas. We'll see later on that maybe he could do tiglachas, but right now we're assuming he doesn't do tiglachas. And the brisa is now telling me, l'chora, according to the consistency with the previous brisa and the way we interpreted the word Toras, that tiglachas is not makeves, and the Isurei Nazir will be terminated and removed even without tiglachas. And that's exactly the way we learned the pasuk of Toras in the previous brisa, the way we interpreted it, in order to ask a kasha on Rav and prove that Tnufa ain't a makeves, we'll have to come to the conclusion, logically and consistently, that tiglachas ain't a makeves. Hachinami, question mark? Is that possible? De lo makeves, tiglachas is not makeves? That's impossible. That's an untenable position. And if it's an untenable position, as we'll prove in a minute from another brisa machlokas Rabbi Cham Beis Hillel, then we cannot interpret the previous brisa as equating a Nazir, first of all, in the case of ein lo kapayim to a Nazir sheyesh lo kapayim, or a case of a Nazir sheyesh lo seir to a Nazir she'ein lo seir. We cannot derive the conclusion that tiglachas ain't a makeves, because that's a position that's untenable. And then we're going to have to conclude that when the brisa equates a Nazir she'ein bo seir with a Nazir sheyesh bo seir, it's coming to teach me that there is such a thing as an external pu'ula, mechanical pu'ula of tiglachas, even with regard to a bald person. And it's going to have to be what we call havaras tar al rosho. It's just a mechanical act in which he pashid waves the razor over his head. And that's going to be the Shita Beis Hillel that we're about to learn. And therefore, we're going to have to assume that a Nazir she'ein lo kapayim, he needs tenufa. Because if a Nazir she'ein lo seir requires tiglachas, then a Nazir she'ein lo kapayim requires tenufa. And again, how are we going to implement the tenufa if he has no kapayim? Then apparently we're going to have to do it on his arm, or the upper part of his arm that he does have. And if that be the case, then this whole question that we raised, the stira to Rav, to prove that tenufa is not makeves, that's not so. Tenufa for sure is makeves. And the chiddush of Toras in equating ein lo kapayim with yesh lo kapayim, like the chiddush of Toras with regard to ein lo sar kisar, is that there's going to be some sort of other act of either tenufa or tiglachas that's going to substitute for kapayim or seah. And that's based on the brisa that we're going to learn now. Vasanya Nazir Mimorot, which means that he's bald, he has no hair. Beit Shammai Omrim Eino Tzarech. It's meaningless. Lahavir Tair al Rosha. So the mitzvah cannot be fulfilled of tiglachas. He just doesn't have hair. How can you fulfill the mitzvah of tiglachas? Beis Hillel Omrim Tzarech. There is a mechanical external act which is called and which fulfills the requirement of tiglachas, of tzarech lahavir tair al rosho, even though he doesn't take off a single hair. V'yamar avinu mai eino tzarech lebeit Shammai. What did Beit Shammai be by eino tzarech? It sounded like Beit Shammai was saying you don't need tiglachas. No. Just the opposite. Eino tzarech means that there's no possibility of tiglachas. V'eino takana. So this bald fellow, he made a mistake by taking upon himself a mitzvah that he cannot fulfill, namely the mitzvah of Nazirus. He cannot fulfill his mitzvah of tiglachas because he has no hair. Now, the way I understood this Gemara here of Ravina is that he would not be able to complete his Nazirus. He'd be a Nazir Olam. Let me just see he quotes here the Rosh. Sorach v'ein lo takona. Okay, maybe that's our pshat. Oh, he says here that since tiglachas is makeves, and according to Beit Shammai, there's no such thing as havaras tar al rosho in the case of meburot. Therefore, he remains a nazir liolam. However, let's keep in mind that there was a shita of Chachamim / Rabbi Shimon that ain't taglachas makeves, and all you need is zrika of one of the damim to remove the Isurei Nazir. You don't even need the kiyum the mitzvah of Giluah. So then, according to that shita, what Ravina is telling us, according to Beit Shammai, is that he cannot be mekayim the mitzvah of tiglachas. Okay, fine, but ain't tiglachas makeves. Now that's according to Beit Shammai. Says Ravina, Hola Beis Hillel yesh lo takona. Right, Beis Hillel has the havaras tar al rosho, and he will be mekayim his mitzvah nazirus. And that would mean that according to Rabbi Eliezer, who holds that tiglachas makeves, he would be matir as nazirus and allowed to drink wine, even with havaras teral rosh. According to Chachamim, even though tiglachas is not makeves, nevertheless he'll be required by virtue of a mitzvah and a chova to be mavir teral rosh in order to be kind of the mitzvah tiglachas, and that's what Beit Shammai is telling me here. But there's no kasha now on Rav, because in both the brisa of Torah's Nazir with regard to Ein Lo Kapayim and the brisa of Torah's Nazir with regard to Ein Lo Seyar, in both cases, we will find a substitute for the literal translation of Tnufa and Tiglachas. Now, the Chiddush of Ravina is really gigantic in the case of Beit Shammai. Beit Shammai says that Eno, what was the language of Beit Shammai was Eno Tzarech. And Ravina is interpreting Eno Tzarech as meaning that, according to at least Rabbi Eliezer, Tiglachas is makeves because he has no takana. So the Gemara says, Hainu Rabbi Pedas. So we're going to find a statement of Rabbi Pedas to support the interpretation of Ravina. Diyama Rabbi Pedas, Beit Shammai, v'Rabbi Eliezer, Omru Dover Echad, and my Rabbi Eliezer, this Sanya. Rabbi Eliezer says that in the case of Taras Mitzora, where the Torah says Vayikru Yudal Nasan, that the Kohen has to put the Dama Oshim on the Bowen, Yod HaYimonis al Bowen Raglo Yimonis, the right thumb, meaning the thumb of the right hand, and the right toe, the toe, the big toe on the right leg. If Ein Lo Bowen Yad V'Regel, he doesn't have a thumb, neither in his hand or his toes. Ein Lo Taro Love is. There's no such thing as a substitute. The Nesinas Dama Osham has to be on the bone in order to kind the Seder Tara. That's Rabbi Eliezer's opinion in the Brisa. Rabbi Shimon Omer Yanichenu al Makomo. We're going to find a substitute for the Nesinas Dam al Boen Yodav Raglov, and we'll put the Dam on the Guf Hamitzora in that place, let's say as a stump, where he would have normally had a Boen, the Yetzeh, and he can fulfill his obligation. V'chachama Omrim Yaniach al Shel Smol V'Yetzeh. Instead of the right hand, we'll put it on the bowen of his left hand. And that will be a fulfillment of his chiyuv of Nesinas Dama Oshem al Bon Yod. Not on Yeminis, but on Smol. Comes along Rav Pedas, and he's going to equate the words of Beit Shammai, who say that in our earlier brisa, that if you have a Nazir Memorat, Eino Tzarech Lahavir Teor, and he's going to equate Beit Shammai with the words of Rabbi Eliezer here in the second brisa with regard to Taras HaMitzorah. And Rabbi Eliezer says, Ein lo tahara olamitz. He can never be mitayar himself from the state of mitzorah, of tuvas tzaras. Why? Because without a bohen, there's no possibility of being mitayar himself. And Rabbi Eliezer interprets the pasuk literally that the Nesinas Adam has to be on bohen yadar hayaminis. And therefore, we're going to say that according to Beit Shammai, we're going to take the same interpretation, says Rabbi Pedas, and a Nazir could not complete his Nazirs forever and ever and ever, according to Rabbi Eliezer, because if you cannot fulfill the parsha, the mitzvah, literally, like for example, he's Mamorat, or for example, another example is Ein Lokaf, then just like Ravina said, he has no other substitute possibilities. You've got to fulfill it literally as it's written in the Torah. Therefore, there's no possibility of tiglachas or of tnufa. And according to Rabbi Eliezer, that would mean that he remains in Nazir Liolam, equating through Torahs all the cases that we had. And we need acher kol hamaisim kulam. Ad kan hakaf aleph. Now we have an entire repeat of the sugya with a different mesorah, different transmission. Again, to some extent, at least it starts with the same statement, that without tnufa, there is no heter for the nazir to drink wine. Okay, so far so good. But here's where we begin a whole new interpretation of the Gemara. I'll leave it to man. Elam, I'll leave it to Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer was the one who says that Kol HaParsha Kuli, the entire Seder HaParsha, is Acher Kol HaBaisim Kul. They're all indispensable and absolutely critical. Pshita. Rabbi Eliezer says, Liachar HaBaisim Kulam. Everything that's written in the parsha is absolutely required in order for him to be Messiah. His Nazirs be Mata L'Yisrei Nazir. Kulam Yakvim. And if he wasn't able to fulfill one of them, then his Nazirs does not terminate. And certainly that would apply to Tnufa as well. So why would Rav have to tell me that Tnufa ben Nazir Markev according to Rabbi Eliezer? Ella, by process of elimination, Rav is talking, I'll leave it to Rabbanon. And the Chachamim hold that even after one Maisa, like Zrikas Dam of one carbon, he's allowed to drink wine. Is Hashli Yeshlom Tiglachas Amri Rabbanon Lo Ma'akve? Is Tnufa Ma'akve? According to the Rabbanon, Tiglachas, which is a Maisa Begufa Nazir, is not likuva, and even if he doesn't shave his head off, he's allowed to drink wine. Is tnufa, which is not even begufa nazimi. Boy, how could Rab say, according to the Rabbanon, that tnufa ben nazir makeves? It's impossible. Now, at this point, we would have anticipated that the Gemara would have added that according to Rav doesn't fit with any shita whatsoever. He says, Afsha Gemara lo mesayemes. This is the Rosh. Kishitas mi nemru divrei Rav. Tzarich lo mashem kishitas Rabbi Eliezer. Okay, fine. So what's the chiddush here of Rav? We just said that according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's pshita because Rabbi Eliezer holds liachar maisim kulam. Hachidush hu sheisvar hayisvar loma shemeachar b'kol karbonos tu fein makeves gamin ozelo kakamash b'shim makeves. that the din of Tnufa, Rav is being Mechadesh, is different in Nazir than it is in Kol Kula. Universal Tnufa is only Shari Mitzvah and it's not Ma'akiv. But Tnufa in Nazir is a Bezundar Halacha. The Brisker Rav has a whole discussion about Tnufa bin Nazir. It's a separate halacha. And again, when you go through the laws of Tnufa, you're going to have to compare them to Tnufa in all Shlomim, let's say to the Tnufa of Shalmi Nazir, and see which dinim belong to the universal Tnufa and which dinim belong to the Nazir Tnufa. But one thing is critical, and that is that according to Rabbi Eliezer, Tnufa bin Nazir Makeves. And that's what Rav was telling us. And the Chiddush is that Tnufa Nazir is a Bezundar Halacha, not to be equated with universal Tnufa, which is only Shiari Mitzvah. So Gemara now is going to raise the question, are you telling me that according to Chachamim, Tnufa is not Ma'akeves, Umilo Ma'akva Vasanya, Zos Toras Han Nazir, Bein Sheyesh Lo Kapayim, Bein She'en Lo Kapayim. So this price is telling me that just like in the case of Nazir She'en Lo Kapayim, it's impossible to implement Tnufa, and therefore the Nazir She'en Lo Kapayim could not possibly complete his Nazirus. Then Zos Toras, the word Toras is going to teach me that even in the case of Yesh Lo Kapayim, Tnufa's Ma'akeves. And I would, if I would add a Kal V'chomer here, because if he has, just 1 second, no. The opposite of a Kal V'chomer. I'm in the middle of Shir. I'll get right back to you. So again, the Gemara is now saying the following, that see, I need this phone to get the internet here because I don't have Wi-Fi, but I forgot to put it on silent. So the Gemara is now assuming that if we equate Yesh Lo Kapayim with Ein Lo Kapayim, again, I'm going to still try to push it by Svara, Rabbi, that if he has Kapayim, then, if he doesn't have Kapayim, then it's Eino Roy Lebila, and therefore Bila Ma'akeves, and now Toras HaNazir, the word Toras is going to tell me that if he has Kapayim, even though he's Roy Lebila, Tnufa is Ma'akeves. So how then can you assume that according to the Chachamim, Tnufa Eino Ma'akeves? So once again, just to summarize, the Gemara's kasha, according to this second lishon of Rav, is that Mimon of Shach, Rav is not telling me anything new. Why is that? Or either he's not telling me anything new, or he's telling me something that's the opposite of what I would have assumed. If he's going according to Rabbi Eliezer, he doesn't have to tell me, goes without saying that Tnufa ben Nazir Ma'akeves, because Rabbi Eliezer Shita is liachar ma'asim kula. Ella what? By proselytization, Rab must be reflected Shita Rabbanan, but the Rabbanan hold it tiglachas is Zayda Ma'akeves, and how much more so Tnufa Eino Ma'akeves. So now the Gemara is questioning that premise that Tnufa Eino Ma'akeves, and the Toras in this last brisa that the Gemara quoted now, equating Yesh Lo Kapayim with Ein Lo Kapayim, is telling me that just like in Ein Lo Kapayim, Tnufa is Ma'akeves, so too in Yesh Lo Kapayim, Tnufa is Ma'akeves. Which is again a big chiddush, because I understand why Tnufa is Ma'akeves in Ein Lo Kapayim is Eino Roy Lebila. But now we have a special pasuk to tell me that even if it's Roy Lebila, nevertheless he needs a tnufa befall, and it's makeves. Now the Gemara is going to say that let's go back to the previous price about Yesh Lo Seir v'Yein Lo Seir that also derives from Torah that all Nazir, when they have hair, they don't have hair, have the same din. And let's see if we can apply the interpretation of this last price that we quoted with regard to Yesh Lo Kapayim and Ein Lo Kapayim and apply the same standards to Yesh Lo Seir v'Yein Lo Seir and be consistent about it. And just like you came to the conclusion that Tnufa is Makeves in this very last price, you're going to have to come to the conclusion that Tiglachas is Makeves. But Hadesanya, we have a price that says Zos Toras HaNazir Bein Sheyesh Lo Seir Bein She'ein Lo Seir, which would mean, if we want to be consistent, that Tiglachas Makeves Achinami D'Ma'akva. But Sanya, what are you going to do with Beis Hillel Beit Shammai? Nazir Memorot, Beit Shammai Omrim, Ein Tzarech Lahavir Te'el Rosh. He cannot fulfill his mitzvah of Tiglachas. He doesn't have any hair. With Beis Hillel Omrim, no. Tzarech, he needs to be Mavir Te'el Rosh. So according to Beis Hillel, let's focus now our attention on Beis Hillel, who maintain that Mavir Te'el Rosho, and that is a fulfillment of his Chiyuv Tiglachas. So it means that even though he doesn't have hair on his head, Ein Tiglachas Makeves Bo. So how can you tell me that from the word Toras, you're going to derive the conclusion of Tiglachas Makeves? As if to say that because he has no hair, he can never terminate his Naziris. No, that's not true. He will terminate Naziris and fulfill his Tiglachas by being Mavir Taro Rosha. That's the way Beis Hillel would have it. So we have no choice but to interpret the price in the following way, that just like somebody who has hair, he needs Giluach. Somebody who doesn't have hair needs Havaras Taro Rosha. And in that case, we go back to the previous brisa with regard to Tnufa, and we're going to say that just like somebody who has Kapayim has Tnufa, somebody who has no Kapayim will find a substitute for Tnufa, like we did in the case of Tiglachas, and Yonif al Yidei Yisra also. So if that be the case, the brisa is not talking about whether Tnufa is Makeves or not Makeves, it's only talking about what would be a fulfillment of Tnufa in a case of Ein Lo Kapayim. So you cannot prove, therefore, that Tnufa is Makeves. And then we go back to Rab's original statement, who said that Tnufa in Nazir is Makeves. And now, according to our Girs, it says Rav Avina, but the real Girs is Ravina. And he wants to reject this interpretation and go back to ask the Kasha on Chachamim. That we assume that according to Chachamim, Tnufa Eina Makeves. Now we reinterpreted it, and now comes along Ravini says, "My tzarech lebeis Hillel tzarech v'ein lo takana." It doesn't mean that when Beis Hillel said tzarech, he was referring to Havaras Tar al Rosha. Says Ravina, no, he meant to say he needs Giluach v'ein lo takana. He cannot complete his Naziris because there's no possibility of Tenufa. And we have to see exactly, according to Ravina, what's the machlokas now between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai. But let's leave that for later on. So it comes out that according to the Brisa, when Torah Achas teaches me that we should equate Nazir she'ein lo sar with the Nazir sheyesh lo sar, that means that in both cases, Tiglachas is Makeves. It's critical. He cannot complete his Naziris without Tiglachas. And then we're going to go back to the previous Brisa of Nazir she'ein lo kapayim, Nazir sheyesh lo kapayim, and we're going to say that Tenufa is Makeves. And this is all an upslug of the proof that we had before that Misvara, according to Rabbanon, ain't Tnufa Makeves. And now the Gemara concludes the words of Ravina. He says, now that you're interpreting according to Beis Hillel that a Nazir must have Giluach, and without Giluach, Ein Lo Takana, and he's a Nazir Liolam, is the Beit Shammai. What now is the Machlok Shim Beit Shammai? Beit Shammai said, Eino Tzarech. Eino Tzarech means he doesn't need Giluach. And it means Yesh Lo Takana. He has a substitute for Giluach, and that's Havaras Tar al Rosha. So this Nusach of Lishna Karina is the exact opposite of what we had earlier. So even though he's not removing a single hair from his head, nevertheless, Yesh Lo Takana, according to Beit Shammai, he has a mitzvah tiglachas, and that's Havaras Tar al Rosh. Upliga, according to Ravina, we are rejecting Rabbi Pedas. Rabbi Pedas said that according to Beit Shammai and according to Rabbi Eliezer, they both said the same thing. And Rabbi Eliezer holds that in the case of Mitzorah, he has no takana if he doesn't have a bohen, and the pasuk has to be fulfilled of Nesinas bohen literally. According to Beit Shammai, yesh l'nazir takana. So Beit Shammai is not reiterating what Rabbi Eliezer or agreeing with the view of Rabbi Eliezer, and even if he has no seyar, he is not makayim the pasuk iksavo, but rather yesh lo takana, and that's what Beit Shammai meant by saying that eino tzar. He doesn't need giluach mamish. The literal translation of tiglachas he can do a substitute tiglachas through havaras seir al rosh. And this leads us to the Mishnah here on the bottom of Daf Mem Vavam in Beis. Gilech ala zevach. A Nazir brought one of his 3 karbanos to complete his Nazirus, and he implemented his Tiglachas Seir, the Nimtza Pasuk. Now he finds out that the original carbon that was brought was Pasuk, which would mean it was a Chatos Shalol Lishma. Just one second. Or alternatively, other karbanos chutzum zman or chutzum komo. So now what happened? He was megaleach based on the krav of a carbon that, as we find out now, is a carbon apostle. And tiglachto psula. Then for sure, he had no fulfillment, the kiyum of tiglachas, because there was no carbon. And uzvachav, let's say he brought the other karbanos, which means, let's say he brought the shlomim the ola, or chatas v'shlomim, chatas v'ola, islo ola lo. They would not be fulfillment of his mitzvah. Why? Because in order to fulfill the mitzvah krava, he needs to have achieved the zmana royal tiglachas. Now, we have to add here to the Mishnah a comment of the Keren Ora. And that's based on the Shita of Chacham back on Daf Mem Vavam and Aleph, that even though Tiglachas Eino Makeves Nazirus, nevertheless, in order to bring his karbonos, he's required to have Seir HaRoyal Tiglachas. If he's a Nazir Shein Lo Seir, then Beis Hillel were of the opinion that he could be marked without Seir. But if he has Seir, that's called Royal Labila, then he must have enough of Gidul Seir such that now he can bring his karbanos. And if, let's say, for whatever reason he removed his Seir, he'll have to grow them again before he brings his karbanos. So if he brought his karbanos and the tiglachas was psula, then it's like a person who brought his karbanos in the middle of his nazirus. So what's going to happen here is he's going to have to grow his hair again, which will take at least a minimum of 30 days. Or wait a minute, according to Rabbi Lezer, 7 days. Let me not forget Rabbi Lezer. According to Chachamim, 30 days. And then he has Seir HaRoy L'Tiglachas. Now he can bring all his karbanos, all 3 karbanos again. Gilach Alachatos, Shalol L'Shma. Now, in the case of a chatas, Shalol L'Shma passes the carbon. And the Achkach Hevi Karbonosov. Lishman is Tiglachto Psula and Uzvachav Lo Olula. So again, the Shlomim and the Ola, which was Shalol Lishma, would still be kosher. In this case, the Shlomim and the Ola was Shechli Lishman. But the Tiglachas, which was implemented after a shchita of Chata Shalol Lishma, which means that the Chatas is completely psula, just throw it into the base hapsul, that Tiglachas was psula, and therefore the other karbanos, namely Shlomim and Ola, could be l'shem nidava, but it's lo Ola bayim l'shem chova. So therefore, the Nazir in this case would require a new Gidul Seir, a week or a month, and then he'd have to bring all 3 karbanos again. And there's a long discussion here about why the Mishnah had to spell this out. I mean, we know that Chata Shalol Lishma is psula. So he has here a whole discussion in the Rush, which is called Agav Seifa. So we'll see the machlok between Rab Shimon and Rabbanan in the Seifa, and that's in the case of a Karban Ola or Shlomim, that was Shalol Lishman, and therefore he brings this case here. Vait in the Mishnah, Gilech ala Ola or Shlomim Shalol Lishman. Now, in the case of an Ola Shlom Shalol Lishman, it's ein of Ola L'Bayil Shem Chova, but it's a carbon kosher as an Adava. And then he went ahead and he was megaleach on either an Ola or on a Shlomim Shalol Lishma. V'achach hevi karbonos of Lishman is tiglach no psula uzvachav lo olulo, and comes along Reb Shimon, he disagrees. Even a carbon nedava, whether it's Shlomim or Ola, is enough. It has, shall we say, a vestige of the status of a carbon Nazir, even though really it's an Adava, so it's really not a carbon Nazir, but also Zevach lo ololo aval shar zvachim olu. So the original Zevach that was shechted shalol lishma cannot be considered as a kiyum of his chiyuv nazirus because it's only a carbon Adava, it's not a carbon Nazir. But the other karbanos, alu l'shem chova. Why? Because according to Reb Shimon, the tiglachas was kshera. Now, why was the tiglachas kshera? Is because it was either the first carbon was either a shlomim or an ola shalol lishma, which is now a carbon adava. And Rabbi Shimon holds that the carbon adava that was once designated for the nazir is enough to allow for tiglachas. And now the Mishnah ends and goes back to the Reisha and Gilech al Shloshtan. V'nimtza echad me'am kosher tiglachto kshera v'yavi shar zvo. Amar Rav Adav Rav Hazoso Meres Kasav Reb Shimon Nazir shegilach al shalmin udavi yotza. Whoa! Now Rabbi Adav Rav takes Rabbi Shimon one step further. Imagine if a Nazir happens to take upon himself an adava of a carbon shlomim, and he was megaleach based on a carbon shlomim, that was the adava, had nothing to do with his nazirus. His yatza, he fulfills his mitzvah of tiglachas. He doesn't have to do another tiglachas, even though he didn't bring a shlomim l'shem nazirus for his chova. And that's what he proves, Rabbi Ada, from Reb Shimon's case when he was machshir in Tiglachas after Akrav Shalom Shalol Lishma, because Shalol Lishma is the din of Nidava. Yeah, but again, there's a gigantic gap over here, because at least originally he was mafresh this carbon shlomim for the sake of his naziris. And even though there was a Shalol Lishma, and it's not a carbon chova, but a carbon nidava, but nevertheless, it was originally a carbon that was designated for his naziris. Rabbi Ada is taking us one step further, and he's talking about a carbon that from the get-go was a carbon nidava. My timer, why is Rabbi Shimon machshir shalmei nidava as a machshir for tiglachas nazir? The Yamakra Pasuk says in the parasha of Nazir, "V'nasana al ha'esh ashetachas zevach hashlamim." Why shlamim? Shlamim is a generic term. It should have said his shlamim, al shlamav, which would mean the shlamim that was for the sake of chovas naziros. But the word shlamim stam implies even shlamim of nidava, and therefore even shlamim dava is b'di'eved, is machshir the tiglachas. And this leads us to the Mishnah on the top of Mem Zayin Amid Aleph, which is the daf for Masechet for Shabbos. Okay then,